Welcome back to Neon Liberalism. I am Samantha Hancox-Li. Since Occupy Wall Street burst onto the scene, politics in America has become increasingly concerned with inequality, with the inequality of wealth, with the increasing share of American wealth that is held by the 1%, by the 0.01%. The presidential campaigns of Bernie Sanders, the rise of the Democratic Socialists of America as a political force, an enduring political force that continues to win elected offices here and there, all seem centrally concerned with this question of inequality and economic inequality. And so I think to try and talk about that, to talk about how it's been received in history, how it's understood in the academy and in intellectual life, I thought I would have on David Lay Williams. David Lay Williams is a professor of political science at DePaul University and the author of The Greatest of All Plagues, a history of wealth inequality in the political philosophical tradition, and also the author of an essay at Liberal Currents about some of these issues. So yeah, David, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Samantha. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I guess my first question is, what's your read on the state of inequality in America? Inequality, discourse about inequality, however you want to take it.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll frame it this way. I originally signed my contract, I think, to deliver this book to Princeton University in 2015. My initial promise was to get it to them in 2 years. The book was not published until 2024. But every time I reach out to my editor to say there's been another delay in finishing this book, I said, but I don't think we have to worry. People are still, this does not cease to be an issue. People are still certainly aware of inequality and kind of the issues that it generates for our politics. So yeah, certainly it continues to grow. I mean, I went back and looked at the introduction to my book the other day, which was published again in 2024, just about 18 months ago, and I cited the fact that it was kind of crazy that someone like Elon Musk, for example, had more than $200 billion, and the last time I checked, Elon Musk now has much closer to $1 trillion, somewhere in the 800 billion range, it's certainly on our minds. I don't know if you happen to notice, there was an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal yesterday saying, yeah, maybe we should be doing something about this, which was pretty stunning to me. It certainly hasn't gone. It's continued to get, the gap between the rich and the poor has continued to grow. People are increasingly aware of it, and I think we live with the effects of that almost every day, it seems.
Yeah, what do you consider to be the effects of wealth inequality on America?
Sure. Well, I'm going to anchor most of my comments in what what the great philosophers said that I talk about in my book, because I'm more an expert on that than contemporary issues. But I think they give us a good framework for thinking about this. And the first person I talk about in my book is the ancient Athenian philosopher, Plato. And a lot of people might be familiar with Plato's treatment of tyranny in Book 8 of the Republic. But in case it's been a while since people have read it, which is fine, or if you haven't read it, I can give a short synopsis. So Plato says that tyranny comes from democracy, which itself evolved from oligarchy. And he says, kind of in the late stage of democracy, we still have the lingering effects of oligarchy. We have a great difference between the very rich and the very poor. And There's a certain amount of chaos that comes with this as he understands it and as he experienced in the ancient Athenian democracy. And he says that democracy ends up, along with this chaos, furnishes both aspiring tyrants and the abettors of tyranny. Namely, you will have a lot of poor and desperate people who sense chaos and trouble and problems. And you will have the aspiring tyrants, which will include very rich people who are more than happy to promise the poor masses anything they want, so long as they cede all power to the tyrant. And so I think this is a good as place as any to start, contemplating some of what we're dealing with right now. As indeed, there are some real concerns about the nature of the current regime that's been empowered, the sources of its political power in this MAGA base. And certainly it's cozying up with oligarchic powers at the same time.
Okay. So here's maybe a slightly pointed question. Why do you think that Plato is relevant today, right? Because like that theory of his, right, democracy is contrasted with the ideal system of government, which is ruled by the philosopher kings, right?
Right.
You take these children from birth, you teach them about geometry, you teach them about mathematics, you teach them about the forms. Naturally, they come to understand virtue and reason. And the decline into, democracy isn't so much a change in institutional structures for Plato as it is a change in like the structure of the soul, right? The democratic man is the one ruled by appetite rather than reason.
Yeah.
Right. And so his vision of what democracy is might seem to be a little distant from what we understand democracy today is, as he in, social and historical context is quite distant from us. So I guess, like, why do you see these philosophers as relevant to the world we live in?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. And it's I totally understand what your point is here about Plato. We don't normally think of Plato as a champion of democracy because he's not, right? At least in the most forthright way. Arguments have been made that he's much more democratic than he appears on the surface. Which I agree with, but certainly if we limit ourselves to looking at Plato's Republic, which is certainly his most famous and widely read dialogue, right? We get a very serious critique of democracy, which doesn't make him seem too relevant or much of a resource for us in trying to salvage, much less maintain a democratic republic. But here's why I find Plato so interesting, especially in combination with some of the other folks I discuss in the book. Plato, not being a Democrat in the classical sense, lowercase d, still finds that economic inequality is a serious problem for any kind of thriving regime. And Plato knew this because he grew up in Athens, and Athens had a history. Indeed, in the first 20 years of Plato's life, they had three class-based revolutions. They had an oligarchic revolution of the rich against the poor, followed by a democratic revolution of the poor against the rich, followed by one more oligarchic revolution of the rich against the poor, all while they were trying to fight Sparta at the same time externally. And you certainly get how this is a problem for Plato, even in the Republic, because he says, when you have this kind of distance between rich and poor, you don't even have one city or one polis. What you have are two cities. You have one city of the rich, one city of the poor. They can't meet in the middle. They have no commonalities that can help them bind together as a single city. And he says, such a city could not possibly win a war. They could have never beaten Sparta with this going on internally. So um, it failed in a democracy. It failed in an oligarchy. It would fail certainly in trying to maintain something like a republic, in Plato's classic Republic, where he expressly emphasizes you have to rein in the inequality to make this work. Why? Because the greater the gap between the poor and the rich, the harder it is for them to find any kind of common ground. And it was this question started with how is he relevant? I think we could use someone like Elon Musk again, right? Elon Musk has said, in podcasts, not this one, but in other podcasts, he says, that one of the great failures of Western civilization was to suggest that empathy is a virtue, right? And I mean, not only does that run counter to what Adam Smith says in Moral Sentiments, maybe we can talk about that a little bit later, but it very much runs counter to what Plato wants to cultivate, right? But also, right, it very much symbolizes the problems we would get. Plato said, if we allow that gap to grow, that somebody with $800 billion couldn't possibly empathize with hungry people, diseased, populations in Africa. It doesn't make any sense to him that he should feel any kind of empathy or have any moral consideration of those people. And that is, for Plato, a direct effect of his extreme wealth.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And like for me personally, one of the things that I really take from Plato, right, is the metaphor of city and soul. This idea that political structures are mirrored in psychological structures, right? Sure. And I haven't read your book, but I think you talk a lot about pleonexia in it, which
Yes.
is this concept in Plato of unsatisfiable desire.
Yeah.
That always craves more and more. There's another one that I'm very fond of, megalothemia, right, which is the overweening sense, not just of the appetites, not just the desire for more food and more drink and more luxuries or whatever, but the desire to be better than others, right?
Yeah.
An uncontrolled desire to always be outdoing other people. And right, for Plato, it's these kind of overweening motivations that like drive inequality in social structures. Is that something that like you pick up in your book at all, or in your analysis of where we are?
Specifically megalothemia or
megalothemia, pleonexia, take your pick.
Okay, so sure. I mean, let me just say briefly about megalothemia. This is basically the French notion of amour propre, which is central to Rousseau's philosophy and his theory of inequality. So it certainly factors into my book, and all my books, in fact, because I've written 2 books on Rousseau. But let me go back to pleonexia, because that is what you initially asked about, and it is one of the common threads that works its way through most of the book. So I think you defined it pretty well, right? It's an insatiable greed, right? This concept emerges in ancient Greece, but it's not unique to ancient Greece. We find it certainly in the Bible, for example. Although much of that is written in Greek. Plato gives a wonderful illustration of what pleonexia is in his dialogue, the Gorgias, where he likens it to a leaky jug. He says you can sit there and pour more water into the leaky jug all day long, and you will never satisfy it. No matter how much you pour in there, it will continue to take more and more. And for the ancient Greeks, and particularly Plato, there are 3 things in life that really are susceptible to that kind of greed. And those things are wealth, which is obviously central to my book, but also importantly, power, right? And finally, what you might call status or public applause, which gets, I think, maybe a little closer to the megalithemia that you mentioned, right? This desire to be better than others, to be recognized as superior to others. And that, again, gets pretty close to the French concept of amour propre. So, yeah, Plato, in fact, to get back to your initial question, about your framing of this about questions of the soul, pleonexia is a problem of the soul for Plato. In fact, it's a disease of the soul, as he characterizes it. And as it's a disease, right? It's as someone who has pleonexia has a fundamentally disabled, malfunctioning soul, right? Not only would it be impossible for them to be a good ruler, it'd be impossible for them to be a good citizen, because among other things, right? It inches people to committing all kinds of terrible acts against their neighbors and fellow citizens, right? To satisfy your desire for more money or power or status. People who are truly pleonectic will do anything, as Plato says in Book 8 of the Republic. They'll do anything, Book 8. They'll do anything to kind of satisfy that desire. And the interesting thing is, Plato introduces this in his dialogues, but it comes up again and again, often even with the Greek, with the very Greek word, not the concept, but the very word pleonexia comes up in surprising places. It comes up in Thomas Hobbes, in Leviathan, in his discussion of the laws of nature. It comes up in John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, interestingly, where he talks about this as one of the deep character flaws, right, of the kind of people that we should distance ourselves from, right? The kind of people we don't want to have any part of. And then, of course, it plays a major role in Karl Marx, for whom pleonexia is substantially enabled by capitalism. It's encouraged by capitalism because of the possibility of infinite accumulation of capital. It kind of stimulates the growth of pleonexia as a kind of tumor on the economy for him.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess that's kind of what I want to ask you about here, right? Is we've talked a little bit about the ancient Greeks, but you mentioned also you see this concept in the Bible, you see it in Mill, you see it in Marx, you see it in Rousseau, right? We could talk about the German philosophers, right? That Hegel, the struggle for recognition seems to be touching on some of the same subject, right? In economics, they would call it positional goods, right? This is Veblen's theory of the leisure class. So it seems like a recurring concern in history, or at least in philosophical history. What's your favorite treatment of it? What do you think is the best place to really understand this kind of drive?
So at the risk of taking us back to Plato once more, he's the first there, and he is the I think he offers kind of the most extended discussion of it. And I think his willingness to talk about, the soul as a fundamental element of his analysis in a way that's, it happens less with more modern philosophers, right? They'll talk characters and personality and these kinds of things. But I think, honestly, Plato's characterization of pleonexia as a disease, I think actually works pretty well for us. We can think of it, in more contemporary terms as a kind of mental illness, right? Right. And we certainly do talk about mental illnesses these days. We don't talk about pleonexia specifically as a mental illness. But, maybe if we took Plato just a little more seriously, we could benefit from that. We could look at people who exhibit the kind of behaviors that concern Plato in a more diagnostic and helpful way, rather than simply, as we do in society, often just end up praising these people as, the winners of society, right? Which is what we do more than anything else.
Yeah, so I am going to be the first to recommend Plato to anybody. The Republic is a great book, so I agree with you. Basically, I think it
Yeah.
is a tremendously valuable text for understanding these questions. But before we fall too deep into the Plato hole,
Yeah.
I guess I thought I would ask, like, okay, like we've been talking about, these are important philosophical concepts. There are books written about them over thousands of years.
Mhm.
How do you see them as applying to society today?
Um, from Plato or just generally? Yeah.
However you want to take it.
Okay, sure. It's not hard at all to see how they apply today. Um, let's move on from Plato for the moment, right? And we can certainly talk about let's pick John Stuart Mill, someone a favorite among many liberals. John Stuart Mill. Is often understood as an advocate of a free market economy, and he is in many respects. Um, he's also a very complex thinker, and somebody who had very serious reservations and concerns about inequality. So one of his major concerns, that's something that Plato doesn't really bring up so directly in this way, is what he calls class legislation. It's in the considerations of representative government, where he addresses this most directly. It does also come up in his autobiography some. Um, and this is Mill's concern about the fact that when you have a handful of very rich people, they cannot help themselves but to commandeer public policy and to bend it to their will. Right. And, in contemporary terms, right, we're talking about, Bernie Sanders or, AOC or some other contemporary, left Democrats, they call this oligarchy. Um, and, so Mill writes a lot about this. He talks about why this is a danger, right? That when you empower a very small number of people, they're not going to exercise this power to help the poor. They will tell you they will do this. Mill says is that they consider themselves to be stewards of the public trust in the same way the feudal masters were, posed as stewards of the serfs. The industrial aristocrats in his time in Victorian England pretended to do the same thing. Oh, we're very rich, but that's given us time and leisure to think about what's truly right for England, and we'll guide policy in a way that will make sure that the poor are taken care of properly, right? And we really don't need the poor people even to vote, right? In fact, that could muddy things up, right? And Mill pushed back against that as well, as did many people in England. And there was the Chartist movement, and they did expand the franchise eventually through a long and slow and painful process. But this tells. So what did Mill say? What can Mill teach us? Right. Well, among other things, Mill said we need to expand the franchise. Mill was a moderate on this. Mill generally preferred slow, progressive change, steady change, but not everything all at once either. Right. I think Mill more than someone like Marx, right? And they're writing both in London at the same time, right? And they kind of give us two very different takes on inequality in important respects. Marx is kind of the more scary person, right? For some people, right? Is this, we just have to tear down the whole system. Mill says, look, we can start these changes within the context of capitalism, right? We don't have to leave capitalism right away, although he's interested in all kinds of experiments. On Liberty calls his experiments in living. He's interested in socialist communes and the like. But he says even outside that, he says within the capitalist system, why don't we have more worker cooperatives? right? Where the workers own and manage the corporations rather than a small number of very rich people, right? And he says, if we do this, right, um, uh, we're going to certainly equalize wages because no company owned by all of its workers is going to say, "Oh, well, why don't we give most of the money to this one person because we like him?" No, they're going to naturally incline to more equality. And Mill's actually optimistic that in a fair and free economy, that this would actually end up being a better business. He says that workers would take more pride in their work if they own their businesses. They would produce better products, and this would have greater appeal to consumers. And he thought, again, in a free and fair economy where you didn't have a handful of oligarchs kind of, stacking the deck, that consumers would gravitate to the products made by worker cooperatives as superior.
Okay. Personally, I'm always pretty dubious about worker cooperatives.
Okay.
Well, because if they're not illegal, right? You can have a
Yeah.
worker cooperative
Sure.
if you want to, but
Hmm.
these predictions, right, that the product will be better, that everybody will flock there, that they'll be more efficient,
Hmm.
don't really seem to be borne out. They haven't outcompeted all the capitalist firms.
Yeah.
You can get into whatever. I don't even actually want to get into the theoretical arguments because
Sure.
that's a whole tedious sidetrack about structures of corporate governance. What I
Sure.
want to ask you about is a different thing.
Hmm.
What I want to ask you about is something you started with.
Mm.
Mill says, okay, we're going to have these rich oligarchs. They're going to say that they're just helping you out. They're just trying to help
Hmm.
the poor. But actually, they're just going to grab government policy. They're going to engage in what we would call regulatory capture,
Sure.
right, and use that to enrich themselves.
Hmm.
And certainly, it seems like we've seen a lot of this in the Trump administration, especially the
Yeah.
second Trump administration, just like this flock of grifters in the Trump court who are there to like shill cryptocurrencies or enrich
Yeah.
themselves on the government dime or buy a pardon or all this stuff.
Hmm.
Um, but I also think it's interesting to talk about this man we keep coming back to, Elon Musk, right? And we see, on the one hand, it looks like Elon Musk effectively buys himself some time in the big chair, right? He
Hmm.
gives Trump 300 million, $250 million of like just cash on the barrelhead, basically in the final stretch of the campaign, comes out of nowhere to do it. And like, as a result, like suddenly Trump is like, oh yeah, that guy, we're going to bring him into government. We're going to create the Department of Government Efficiency that he believes in.
Yeah.
Doge is going to make the government more efficient, blah, blah, blah. And Musk really is running a lot of policy, right? In the early days of the Trump administration, we see huge firings, a lot of chaos. There was a lot of fear that they were going to seize control of this or that treasury payment system, which they did in some ways.
Hmm.
Um, Probably the thing that is most notable about him, the most durable impact of his tenure at Doge, is the gutting of U.S. aid, right?
Yeah.
Which is this, in the scale of the federal budget, like a little raindrop
Right.
in a storm. But
Hmm.
it turns out to be a very important raindrop if you are in Africa and
Yeah.
suffering from AIDS
Yeah.
or various other forms of diseases. Probably this is going to kill a few million people over the next
Yes.
decade, right? An
Yeah.
enormously destructive, impactful result of Musk basically buying himself political influence.
Yeah.
I don't think Musk is getting rich off of gutting US aid,
Right.
right?
Hmm.
I don't think Doge was principally about funneling money to Elon Musk, right? Rather, he was
Hmm.
pursuing it seems to me very much like he was
Yeah.
pursuing an ideological agenda, one
Yeah.
that is a little bit strange and hard to understand. We've talked a little bit about it in previous podcasts, so you can go listen to those if you want to. Um, but it doesn't seem to me that this is driven by this accumulative drive that we've been talking about. So I'm curious, like, what your
Yeah.
analysis of like these events is.
Yeah. So, right. I mean, I think it's at least a couple of things, right? One is something we already talked about a little bit, right? Which is the disabling of any kind of capacity for human empathy, right? As most people would understand it, right? So there's that on the one hand, and then on the other hand, it is something that we certainly find in the tradition as well. Maybe Hobbes is a good example here. I can talk a little bit about him. Hobbes says that one thing you find with very rich people is that they think they know better than others, right? Um, it's the way they've lived their lives, the kind of feedback they've gotten from everybody all their lives, which is a lot of sycophancy, flattering, right? They begin to think that if they say it, it has to be true. If they think it, if they feel it, it has to be true. And even Plato talks about this. Plato talks about the princes Cambyses and Darius Xerxes in ancient Persia. They were princes who were flattered by the staff that raised them, told how great they were. And then Plato says when they eventually rose to power, they were complete disasters because they had no sense of not just limits, like in terms of what they could acquire, but they had no capacity to understand the nature of the problems. He specifically said they have no wisdom in his sense, right? Not just in the philosophical sense of knowing the forms, which they also don't have, but they don't even know what's going on in their own countries. All they know, all they ever hear from people their whole lives pretty much is how great they are, right? So, and of course, these were the kind of people that Socrates made a sport of picking on in the agora, right? He would find these successful business people, in the agora, and say, "Oh, you're a very rich, successful person. You must know what the definition of friendship is," right? And they always fell for it, right? And then, "Oh, of course I know. I'm such a great person," right? And then, the fun of the dialogues is seeing how Socrates, deconstructs them so easily and with great humor, and with his students standing aside, and including Plato, just lapping this up is hilarious. Exposing
Basically
his
the Isaac
buffoons.
Chotiner of his age.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, right. And and then maybe I'll bring Adam Smith in here as well now. And Adam Smith has this passage in the Lectures on Jurisprudence where he says that the very rich don't even understand themselves to be accountable to the same moral code as anybody else, right? They're kind of superhuman, right? And so they don't even think of themselves as being morally accountable in the same way that everybody else does, right? And so and look at the way that Elon Musk, when he reasons about this kind of stuff, right? And it often comes in this kind of futurist sense, right? Oh, well, maybe people will die now, but I'm building this rocket ship that we're going to establish colonies on Mars, and I'm saving the whole human race. We get this kind of perverse utilitarian calculus going on here that he's able to justify. But it takes a certain kind of detachment from ordinary moral norms to get himself there, which is, I think, greatly facilitated by his enormous wealth.
Okay. So I guess I kind of want to ask you a little bit about some of the criticisms you've received, right? And, again, this essay that you recently wrote for us talks about this, that some people have looked at this concern for inequality, right? They've looked at the increasing salience of, we are the 99% kind of rhetoric. And they say, well, actually, that's a disease of the soul, right? That's the disease of envy,
right?
Right? That like, oh, you're just jealous, right? You just think that the ultra rich have a lot of stuff, and if you take some of it, you'll have more stuff.
Yeah.
Right? And there's like the envy line you can take, and in some ways, I think that, to be fair to your critics, there is a real line in American political culture that they're picking up on, right? When people say, oh, why can't we have nice things? Or why don't we have universal health care? We should just tax billionaires. And if we tax billionaires, we could easily have universal health care. And to me, like the math doesn't really work on that, right?
Mhm.
Billionaires are very wealthy. Like, let's be
Yeah.
real there, but there are
Mhm.
also a lot of Americans, and healthcare is expensive.
Mhm.
You
Sure.
could not pay for Medicare for all just by taxing billionaires. To take
Mhm.
like the big example here,
Mhm.
um, and so I tend to be a little bit skeptical of like these kind of like redistributionist line, or at least some versions of it.
Mhm.
Um, I guess I'm curious, like, what's your read of the discourse here? Like, your critics, what are they responding to? Like, what do you think of them? I don't know.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a very common critique of egalitarians, that their primary motive in arguing for a more equal distribution um, is that they're driven by envy. Envy is a sin, right? And therefore, the whole notion of being egalitarian is inherently suspect or invalid. Um, so indeed, right? This exchange that culminated in this liberal currents piece that I wrote for you guys, was just responding to one of these critics, right? She says, "Look, um, much of what the Bernie Sanderses of the world, what's motivating them is envy, right? And we don't tolerate that with children. Why should we tolerate that in public policy?" So yeah, and I confess I do not take that criticism very seriously, um, because there's a lot of very rational arguments against uh, extreme inequality, right? And it's interesting. So one of the critics uh, of the egalitarians that I cite in one of my pieces in this exchange actually cited John Stuart Mill and his critique of envy in On Liberty. And it's actually in that same passage I cited earlier about pleonexia. I think it's in chapter 4 of On Liberty. And I found that very interesting, right? So, Mill does criticize envy, says, that's an unfortunate disposition of the soul. But then he has all kinds of things to say about how bad inequality is. So either we can accuse Mill of being, of contradicting himself, that would be one strategy, but I take Mill seriously enough as a philosopher that I don't think he simply contradicts himself in ways like this. I think Mill thinks that envy is a bad thing, and also thinks that that inequality causes all kinds of problems. And you can be concerned about oligarchy. You can be concerned about the effects of inequality on people's character. You can be concerned about the way it introduces social tensions and these other things that Mill and others argue, without having to address envy at all. But I might even push a step further, and I don't really do this in the article, but there's an argument to be made that maybe if people are that envious, maybe it says that there is something fundamentally wrong too, right? Michelle Schwartzy at University of Wisconsin Madison has a book called "Recognizing Resentment," and she doesn't address inequality so much in that book, but she's becoming more interested in it now. I know she's been teaching a class on inequality. And oftentimes people have emotions for real reasons, and it's not it's if someone steals my wallet and I get mad. I mean, Seneca tells me it's bad to be mad. Right? He's a smart philosopher. So is it my problem then that I'm mad, right? Or is it the problem that somebody stole my wallet, right? And we could look at envy that way too. And as I said, I didn't argue that in my article, but I think that would certainly be an argument that we probably should have if we want to flesh this all out, with people who are very dismissive of inequality as simply the manifestation of people's insecurities and
So
flaws.
I think that's interesting that that you frame it as like, yeah, maybe these emotions are a reaction to a real circumstance or a real problem. Um, right. And to kind of put a sharper point on some of these questions, right, there's a recent book that people have talked about called Abundance, right, by Arthur Klein and Derek Thompson. And give them this, they're really clear about what they mean by abundance, right? They
Mhm.
say, well, there is a kind of a redistributionist frame of politics which
Mhm.
says we're going to give you more stuff by taking stuff away from those other people. And they see this on the left and the right, right? The
Mhm.
left says we're going to give you more stuff by taking stuff away from billionaires. But they see it
Yeah.
on the right too, right? We're
Mhm.
going to give you more stuff by taking it away from immigrants, right? We're going to
Right.
like this came up in the campaign.
Or
What's your
yeah.
solution to the
Mhm.
housing
Mhm.
crisis, Mr. Trump? It's mass
Mhm.
deportations.
Yeah.
Um,
Right. Or we're going to
right. And
take CBS away from the liberals and give it to the conservatives. Yeah.
right. And
Yeah. Yeah. Mhm.
Klein and Thompson say,
Yeah.
well, we want to propose a different
Mhm.
model, right?
Yeah.
Their view is we don't have enough stuff to start with
Mhm.
along a variety of axes, whether it's housing or
Mhm.
energy or et cetera. And what we
Yeah.
need to do is make more stuff. And that'll be
Mhm.
how we, solve the real problems in America
Mhm.
today. What do
Mhm.
you think of that picture of what's going on?
Yeah. So I confess I've not read the book yet. So I don't want to get too into the weeds in this before I start saying things that I can't possibly defend. I would say in general, I can see some appeal in in some of that, right? I mean, maybe I don't know if they address housing as an example,
Oh,
but
housing is central to the book. Yeah.
yeah, right. I mean, housing seems like housing is extremely expensive right now, and a tremendous number of young people trying to start their lives simply cannot afford to buy a home, right? And a lot of this is, artificially suppressed by the lack of housing in this country, right? And we're not making this any better by deporting, all the, immigrant labor in this country either, right? These people are largely building new housing for us. Getting rid of them seems to work against a solution here. So yeah, I mean, I can certainly imagine in cases like that, but I don't want to. I don't want to get too deep into talking about
Sure.
a book. I know there's controversies about that book too, and I don't know it well enough to engage that too deeply.
Okay.
Mhm.
So maybe I'll try to bring it back to some of what your critics have accused you of, I
Mhm.
suppose, where they say, well, look, many of these authors that you're talking about, they lived in zero-sum societies, right?
Mhm.
Societies that
Yeah.
were
Okay.
genuinely where stuff was extremely scarce, right? Plato lives in
Mhm.
conditions that we would recognize as extreme scarcity, and
Yeah.
his luxurious philosophical life is built on quite literally slave labor,
Mhm.
right? As are the lives of all the ancient Greek
Yeah.
philosophers,
Mhm.
right? And so, like, what prompts megalothemia? Like, like you talked about these revolts in ancient Athens, like the
Yeah.
oligarchic revolt versus the democratic revolt, but
Mhm.
that's all revolts among the citizens of Athens, right?
Sure.
These aren't slave revolts. Right.
Mhm.
These are
Yeah.
like one group of slave owners trying to get a better deal over a different group of slave owners.
Yeah.
Right. And so authors like Deirdre McCloskey would say, well, the whole point of the modern world is that we should escape that situation where,
Mhm.
in order for me to have more, someone else has to have less.
Yeah.
Right? We should just forget about all that zero sum thinking.
Yeah.
And I guess what's your response to that criticism?
Yeah. Well, certainly, right. I don't know if you're familiar with Darren McMahon's book, Equality: The History of an Elusive Idea. It's a great book, really terrific. Came out about a year before my book. And this is actually one of the central themes of his also longue durée history of equality and inequality. He talks about how as the West has had debates about equality over the centuries. A lot of it, a lot of the arguments for equality have been built on a foundation of inequality, right? And the ancient Greeks are a good example of that, right? You have this culture that's going to have equality within it, but it stands on a foundation of but these people are not going to be considered at all, right? And that happened with slaves, of course, with women, right? It's happened, of course, with different racial and ethnic groups. You know, McMahon does a good job even talking about fascist notions of equality, right? We're going to have Aryan equality, but these other people, well, they're not part of the calculus. So that's very real, right? And I acknowledge this in my book, certainly when it's particularly relevant to authors like Plato, for example. That yeah, I think when we read them, we have to be aware of this, right? I don't think that means, however, that their concerns are irrelevant, right? And when the concerns about inequality are irrelevant, right? And bring it back to the zero sum issue that's raised by McCloskey, but others, certainly Tyler Cowen, Steven Pinker, they all talk about this and raise this concern. Donald Boudreaux, with whom I had this exchange. So they argue, well, before Adam Smith, it was a zero sum economy, right? And somebody making money, you could plausibly argue, was taking money out of the hands of somebody else. And in that kind of context, you could make a better case that extreme inequality is problematic. But in a non-zero sum economy, kind of post Adam Smith, right? In a market economy built on the exchange of goods and the accumulation of capital and the growth, and specifically, right, the thing that comes out of Adam Smith is a growing economy, right? The argument is that everyone is made better off, right? And there are good Smithian arguments for this, right? And Smith, right? If you go back and read the first couple of pages, even of Wealth of Nations, Smith provides the moral justification for the whole rest of the book. He talks about the fact that there was great equality in hunter-gatherer societies, but also everybody was kind of on the verge of starvation all the time, right? And we don't want that for people moving forward, right? So if we grow the economy, right, we will produce, this kind of, to bring us back to the word abundance, right? We'll create more goods that will benefit everyone. And Adam Smith even makes the further argument, right? As you continue to grow the economy, you will increase the demand for labor, and increased demand for labor will raise wages. Smith is optimistic here that there'll be upward pressure on wages over time. That's not the only force controlling wages. Smith is at the same time concerned about collusion against workers. He's concerned about an imbalance of wealth that employees can hold out, much longer than workers can in a strike, for example, and therefore can kind of push those wages back down. But overall, he's optimistic that a growing economy will produce these benevolent effects for everyone in the economy. So all that being stated, and I think we have to grant a certain amount of that. I don't think that's all wrong. I think there's a lot that's right in there. And, I don't regret the fact that refrigerators exist now and other things, that have been invented by, a market economy. But that doesn't mean that oligarchy isn't a problem anymore, right? It doesn't mean that we're still not dealing with these problems of a lack of empathy on the part of the extreme oligarchs. It doesn't mean that we're not dealing with problems of social tensions. And I guess what my frustration is in arguing with the likes of McCloskey and Boudreaux and the like is that is a real failure, I think, to acknowledge the complexity of these issues. That you can make an argument that inequality introduces these problems, but because of the overall abundance it generates, maybe on balance it's a little bit better than what we had before. But that's not the argument that they're making, right? The argument is inequality isn't a problem at all, right? And this is where I think they're bad students of Adam Smith, right? They like the part from Adam Smith about growing the economy, but they don't acknowledge the way Adam Smith did that. But yeah, when you do that, you do create these other problems, right? The problems of whole different systems of morality applied to the rich versus the poor, the lack of empathy, the danger of oligarchic takeover of public policy, all these things that certainly concerned Adam Smith and should rightfully concern all of us.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. To be honest, right, to put my own cards on the table here a little bit, I one of the reasons that I like Plato, I like the stuff that I see in your work, is this concern with character, as with the internal motivations, right? Because some of these arguments seem to assume, such and such businessman got rich under capitalism, under this growing economy, therefore, like, surely what he supports is a growing economy. But that's not really what we see, right? This when we talk about crony capitalism, right, we don't see, mega billionaires out there lobbying for stuff that's going to increase economic growth. We see people who are consumed, I think, with megalothemia, right? With this obsession with having the most, or not even in like this purely self-directed way, but specifically like having more than other people, right?
Yeah.
That they see competition fundamentally as a threat and they don't like it, even though like competition is what created them and enabled them in certain ways.
Sure.
What do they do with power is they try to crush competition, right?
Yeah.
They try to recreate a zero-sum world because that's how they think, right?
Yes.
Because that is how their character has been shaped.
Right.
And so to me, like, the fundamental problem with inequality, it's not that I envy the rich, it's that I think they're dangerous, right? I think that power is power. Economic power can buy political power. Not always, it's complicated, blah, 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 but like we just saw it happen. We all just saw it happen with Elon Musk buying himself a government position and using it quite aggressively. Maybe not to enrich himself, but to pursue a kind of frankly demented policy agenda. To put it mildly, one that like there's a rationale there, but it's not really a sane rationale. It's not like a rationale that has been tested by debate among peers, but that just brews in the head of one guy who nobody can say no to. So he's just kind of high on his own supply in that way. So to me, that seems like the core of the problem here is that all this stuff like, oh, it's envy. It's like, that's really missing the point. Like, who is most afflicted with envy? It's the rich, right? They are the ones who are consumed by these kinds of comparative desires.
Right. Yeah. And in fact, I mean, that kind of brings us back to pleonexia, right? Because you want to say to these people, if you ever got close enough to them to say it, shouldn't you be happy now? Right? You have everything. You have more money than anyone in the history of the world, right? Take a victory lap, pat yourself on the back. But why do you still have this impulse to be a menace to others, right? And part of it is this insatiable drive, right? I've got to prove that I'm still better than everybody else, right? And look at somebody like Donald Trump, if we can. You mentioned that they try to make it a zero-sum game when maybe it wasn't a zero-sum game anymore, right? Donald Trump won the presidency. Okay, good for you, right? But it wasn't enough for him to win, right? He has to imprison his opponents, right? Because it's he can that's the equation for him. I win, I must imprison my opponents now, right? That's justice. That's the fair world, and I can only be happy if these people are made to suffer, right? It's a deeply unhealthy disposition for people to have. But a lot of it comes from this, these kind of psychological problems that we can trace back to the ancients. To borrow from Adam Smith one more time, But via Adam Smith, will ultimately go back to St. Augustine. Adam Smith talks about an element of human nature that he's not fond of, right? But he says is real. He says that there is this impulse among many people, um, not just to win, but to dominate, right? And it's deeply concerning to him. And for a lot of people, they could only feel happy if they exercise complete domination, power over others, right? And that is what Saint Augustine called the libido dominandi, right? The lust to dominate. Which is, I teach Saint Augustine in one of my classes at DePaul, and students find the libido dominandi to be completely fascinating. They're all very skeptical. We're going to read a medieval Catholic theologian. Like, hang in there with me. This guy is pretty great. And you can see it, right? In the way that some of these oligarchs exercise power. Musk again here is the prime example. What's the most perfect way to demonstrate your power to dominate others? The capacity to kill hundreds of thousands or millions of people with a snap of a finger. Right. So that's not even about earning more money, as you said, right? It's about demonstrating power, which is certainly connected. I mean, money facilitates getting there, to having that power. It's maybe not the only route there. Stephen Miller, I don't think, is rich, but would love to exercise the same kind of power. But money certainly facilitates for some people the ability to get there and do these kinds of frankly horrific things.
No, I think that's right. I mean, you talked earlier about amour propre, this notion in Rousseau that we live to some extent in the eyes of others. We want to be recognized, and sometimes we want to be recognized as better. We want to be recognized as winners and not losers.
Yeah.
And in some ways, I do think that is a pretty fundamental human drive. We like it. We like recognition. We like winning. That part's true. But what I think, I actually kind of hate Rousseau, but I think he's good about this just on a personal level. He seems like a really repugnant individual. But this concept that he has of inflamed amour propre, right? That it can, whether you call it inflamed amour propre or you call it megalothemia or whatever it is, that this can devour you, right? That this desire, it's not just that you want to win when you're playing Settlers of Catan tomorrow night, but you need this overwhelming drive for domination in all things, and to crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and to hear the lamentations of the women. And when that consumes you, you get some real evil stuff out at the other end.
Yeah, I mean, yes. It's the answer to that. And we're seeing it. We're certainly seeing it. Yeah, and again, it's for Rousseau, it's a fairly it's a normal thing to happen to people in society, right? But there are better and worse forms of this, right? Rousseau encourages us as much in republics to try to honor the good things, right? To honor sacrifices to the republic, service, love of neighbor, these kinds of things as much as we can. Honor those things and make that the source of status. And as far as we can do that, we can try to make amour propre work for us. But the vast bulk of what he says about amour propre is basically what you said, right? That the way it manifests is in these powerfully negative ways, through domination, through utter defeat of competition, right? And Marx says, of course, this is ultimately what capitalism is, right? Capitalism is for him, right, this competition, right, and it's a competition to win, right? You win by putting your competitors out of business, right? And he says you get status, you get money out of that, and so it goes. Says capitalism utilizes this very effectively.
So we could probably do a whole episode or a whole series or a whole podcast or a whole life really about Marx.
Sure.
But I do kind of want to
Mhm.
close with just a little bit more about him.
Mhm.
Um, and to bring it back actually to McCloskey, to Deirdre McCloskey.
Sure.
And in her book, Bourgeois Dignity, I think she takes a very different tack than a lot of
Mm.
other economic historians. She is trained as an economic historian, but she says, like,
Mhm.
what is capitalism? It is a transformation of the human soul in important
Mhm.
ways,
Mhm.
right? That it is about the rise of new values of
Yeah.
hard work and commerce
Mhm.
and thrift
Yeah.
rather than
Mhm.
violence and domination and the old
Yeah.
aristocratic values. And I think there's
Yeah.
something to that. I think it's
Mhm.
not actually a bad thing to want to live a better life, right? To want to
Sure.
have access to better
Mhm.
medical care, or live in a
Mhm.
nicer house, or have nicer
Yeah.
things
Mhm.
by working hard and producing a good product that other people want to pay
Yeah.
for and are willing to pay you
Mhm.
for. Right? I
Mhm.
think there is something to that. And I
Yeah.
guess, like, how do you see this? Like, do you see this as like there's some fundamental tension where it's like, yeah, you want to do
Mhm.
better, you want to have a nicer life, and that's
Yeah.
always going to lead you in this pleonectic direction? Or is there a way
Yeah.
to try and find a balance here?
Yeah. I think and, look, I want these things too. And if my dean, heaven help us, were to offer me a raise, I would say yes. I wouldn't say no. So and I think it's a very natural thing for people to want some degree of comfort and security, among other things. Um, so and it's look, in my book, I'm not generally making my own arguments. I'm not saying what I want in the world. What I'm the thrust of the book is why all the reasons that kind of this group of philosophers from the past all had concerns about inequality, which I do share. I confess. Um, so the question of whether capitalism can produce the good stuff without the bad, you know um, I think needs to be a real live debate, right? And look, I think a lot of Marx's criticisms of capitalism are right. I think a lot of what Smith said is right. Um, so I'm not a hardcore ideologue on either of these things, on either of these ends of the spectrum, I should say. What I maybe I'll bring it back to Mill once more, right? And what does Mill encourage us, right? Well, Mill says, look, I don't have all the answers here. Mill says, what I do know is we have lots of problems right now. He believed in progress. He believed with freedom, right? That we could actually have the ability to experiment with a lot of different things, right? Including, as I mentioned, right, socialist communes. He thought it was important that we try this, right? And later in life, he said, you know what? I probably am a socialist. I think if we can make this work, this would be best. Right. At the same time, though, he was encouraging us to tinker with capitalism, to see if there weren't ways that we could make it more humane. Right now, that's Marx actually totally resists that. Right, Marx like you can't tame this beast. Right, it's like taming the devil. Right, you can't do it. Right, it's the very nature of the thing that's going to produce all these malevolent consequences. And look, I mean, I know there are people who fundamentally think Marx is right about that, and I enjoy talking with them because the sincerity of their views about this is appealing to me, and again, I think Marx did get a lot of stuff right. It's not like he's wrong with a lot of his critiques of capitalism. A lot of them are spot on. So, where am I going to end up? I'm going to end up less on a policy place than in intellectual space. And I think the intellectual space also kind of takes me back to this debate that sparked this invitation to this conversation, which is I think we need to have more conversations, more honest conversations about what inequality does to society. What's the role of capitalism in this? How scary is socialism? And not just say, not just say because someone, I don't know, people are accused of being a socialist for all kinds of reasons, like because they believe in public schools, for example, they're accused of being a socialist. I think we need to have more. Heaven help us. We should have more rational conversations, free intellectual debate. I certainly don't think we're going to improve things as they're trying to do in Texas by telling people they can't read Plato. Right? I don't think that's going to help us make real progress on this. Right? And I think Mill is very helpful for us here. Right? We need to have a free and open discussion and acknowledge when the other side has the better part of an argument, right? And see where that gets us.
Words to live by. David Leigh Williams, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Samantha.